The Second International Brass Congress took place at Indiana University in June 1984. It was my privilege to help schedule the various events during the week, and I would like to share with you one especially significant moment. Arnold Jacobs, the tuba player for over 40 years with the famous brass section of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and teacher of countless professional brass instrumentalists around the world, was the honored guest of the Second International Brass Congress. During one of the infrequent lulls in the proceedings, many of Arnold Jacobs' students, covering 50 years of teaching, gathered with him in an informal discussion of the many facets of musical performance that have been researched and so successfully applied by this great master. The students themselves included many of the world's most distinguished performers, which would appear to be a very strong indication of Arnold Jacobs' pedagogical skills. These great musicians' thirst for even more of their teacher's knowledge is a revealing clue to the depth of his study. It was my honor to moderate this forum. My name is D. Stewart. There is one uniting force that has drawn us all together, and that is the fact that we have all studied our chosen instruments with the same instructor. May I present Arnold Jacobs. We may have a teacher in common, but Arnold Jacobs is far from a common teacher. Mr. Jacobs has trained a great many successful players on all brass instruments and has made a lifelong study of the art of the mechanics of tone production of brass instrumentalists. Not only is he a great pedagogue, but he has been a tremendous performer and force in the world of music. For over 40 years, he has been the tuba player with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and as such has established a tradition of quality performance that will probably always be the standard and the role model for tuba players. We are on the campus of Indiana University at the International Brass Congress II, where Mr. Jacobs has been honored this afternoon as the honor of the International Brass Congress, chosen because he has been the strongest force in the world of brass, teaching and playing over all of our lifetimes. We would like to have a very free-flowing discussion this afternoon. It may take any number of courses, but there are several of us who have studied with him recently, and there are some of us who have studied with him in the distant past. There is one gentleman here who studied with Mr. Jacobs in 1936, which represents about 50 years of teaching. I always had a question in my mind, and maybe you'd like to speak to this, Mr. Jacobs. We've heard about how you got started as a player, as a bugler and then trumpet player, and how method books were non-existent and so forth. And that story I've heard a few times. But I often wondered how you got interested in the study of the production of sound that you've made such a lifelong experience with. Would you like to speak to that?
You want me to start at the beginning?
Sure.
It goes way back. While I was at the Curtis Institute of Music, I started there on a scholarship at the age of 15 and continued there to the middle of 1937. At that time was 21 and 22, I think, when I left. Almost 7 years. While studying at the Curtis Institute of Music, I started to study voice. And I actually was offered a scholarship in the vocal department at the Curtis Institute of Music. And I was taking lessons from a tenor by the name of Luigi Bocelli. And he's passed on. He was blind, but a very fine tenor voice. But he started working with me, and he had me forcing my voice so badly that I couldn't sing. I was constantly losing my voice through sore throats and telling me to support my tone. This is where we go right into respiration. And the efforts involved, based on his language, the use of words, I kept straining and working harder and harder. And when I was offered a scholarship finally at the Curtis Institute, I turned it down because I found singing so unpleasant I just love it today, but in those days, I didn't like the sore throats. But the language of support your tone and the terminologies were leading me into excessive physical efforts and contraction states. I didn't think of it along these lines back in the 30s when I was a very young man, but I kept on singing because I loved it, but I just didn't formalize it with a teacher at the time. During the course of my stay at the Curtis Institute, Stokowski needed to have a group of 12 male voices from the Curtis Institute to sing the Stravinsky King of the Stars. And they needed one more basso, and my solfege teacher, Madame McHale, recommended me to Stokowski for the position as the fourth basso. And so I sang for Stokowski, and he accepted me. I don't think we ever put the performance on. I forget what happened, but they had to change the program for some reason. But anyway, I was accepted for the part, and they called me into the office at the Curtis Institute, and they said, this is your entrance into the vocal department. You can now put your tuba away and stay with us as a singer. And I thought of the sore throats, plus the fact that I used to like to go out and play jobs on string bass, jobs on tuba, sometimes trumpets and trombones and whatever in those days. I was having fun. So I turned the scholarship down because they said I would have had to give up the tuba and concentrate just on singing, and it would be an additional 6, 7 years at school, and I just was on the tail end of my 6 or 7 years then. So I turned it down, but I continued to be interested in it. And this was actually what motivated me into working a bit on the study of breath. I wondered, why am I so comfortable playing the tuba and so miserable when I'm singing? And I did some professional singing in a radio station, WPEN in Philadelphia, and with quartets, some church singing at the Second Presbyterian with Alexander McCurdy. So I did some professional work as a singer, but I was never very comfortable with it. And so I remember calling my wife's friend. My wife was very excellent in physiology. In the days when she was in high school, they had a physiology teacher, Calumet High School in Chicago, that really excelled, and she became very competent at the medical drawings, the anatomy drawings. And so she was telling me, you know, we're talking about diaphragms, and I'm pointing at my navel and things, and she says, no, it's not there, it's up here. And she described the effect of the domes of the diaphragm and how they descend and so forth. This is from my wife. She knew more about it. She's a dancer. So anyway, she had a girlfriend that was a nurse, and I decided I was going to look into this. And so I called her nurse and this little lady, and I said, what do you know about diaphragms? And she wouldn't speak to me. And I finally got across to her, I'm talking about respiratory functions. And so then she sent me over a book of anatomy and physiology that the nurses use in their training. And I read through it, and I found it fascinating. At that time, we had a lovely little lady who was our family physician, Dr. Margaret Buck. Now, we're going way back into the 40s. And I talked to her about my desire to learn a bit of structure and function. And anyway, she guided me through this period in terms of advising me on literature to have and where to start. Study the skeletal structure first, learn about the bit of anatomy, but do it on a sensible basis. In other words, learn about the a structure. Don't just start with respiration. Learn what human beings are, how we're structured. I had plenty of time, and the interest was there. So anyway, I started a program which I thought would be of short duration. This is in 1944. This is now 1984, and I'm still at it. I've never stopped. The subject became so fascinating. When you study the structure and then the function of the human being, you do this for your lifetime and many future lifetimes, and the answers will still not be in. The subject is of enormous scope, and I went through the stages of studying the machine, the human machine. When I realized how little that meant, I had to start seeking out function. How are we controlled? In other words, what permits this to be a function? You then have to go into the nervous system. You have to go into the brain. You have to go into lifestyles and life patterns, body types, somatotypes, all sorts of things that you'd never expect to have to go into. This was just a never-ending study of enormous complexity, and if I had known of the complexity at the time I started, I probably would have closed the book and said, no way, I would want to go fishing and, you know, have some fun. but there was an ever-increasing fascination. And you can just see, if you want to help a person, you will find simple answers to complex situations. The complex answers do not fit the picture. It's like I said today in my little lecture there, you talk about machine systems where you find the anatomy of a machine. All right, once you know the anatomy of a machine, you have to have a fine mechanic to operate that machine, to know how to repair it when something goes wrong. Well, we have our physicians who do that when we are ill. He knows our anatomy. There are surgical techniques and wonderful things they can do for us. And I've had it done for me and appreciate it very much. But to use your own structure, just like your own car, unless you plan to repair it yourself, you don't need to know about the various phenomena of piston function and differentials and all sorts of details under the hood and in boxes and things of that type. You have to know how to go through the control system to get the car to do what you want it to do. Well, I've studied people in various situations of athletics. I've looked into the lifestyles of people, the Australian Aborigine, the people who are untutored in various parts of South America, and how they do tremendous physical feats. They dance, they play flutes, they play drums. They use their bodies for enormously complex things, and then there are no PhDs. And so I figured, well, you know, let's face it, you know, these people are doing things. I have a trumpet player that comes up from Mexico for lessons. He can hardly read or write, but he plays great. So obviously, he doesn't know how he plays great, but he has certain aspects of his particular musical development that he, as an interpreter of that style, is marvelous at, and I enjoy listening to him.
I'm glad I asked that question. That's very nice. Did your tuba playing, though, was firmly established at the time you started studying?
My tuba playing was firmly established by the time I was 15 years old. I used to sit down, my mother played piano. I would play all the melodic lines to Poet and Peasant Overture, to William Tell. I would play very difficult music without having the faintest idea of what I was doing. I knew from her coaching what the music should be like. I used to listen to Herbert Clark and the Long Beach Municipal Band. I'd hear wonderful playing, I'd hear wonderful musicians, and I didn't know anything. When I went up for the Curtis Institute of Music audition, I played the Arbon Carnival of Venice, the entire set of variations, and Stars in a Velvety Sky. And I was accepted as a student at the Curtis Institute. And I know if you had mentioned diaphragm, I wouldn't have known what you were talking about, or respiration. That didn't. But I was a fine player.
Well, when you got into the study of it, did this assist in your playing, or did you find it tampering with your playing in any way?
Not a bit. I wear two hats. When I study structure and function, I wear the hat of the investigator, the student. When I am on the stage with a horn, I wear the hat of the performer, the storyteller. But I do not let them cross over.
I think since we have such an illustrious group here, this may be the golden opportunity for them to ask you some questions, and I'd like to suggest that they do that at this time. We have a gentleman in the back row who did actually study with you in 1936. 37, Irvin Hollingsworth.
Yes,
and,
yes, 37.
Now that's even before you really started studying these things.
Much
but when
before,
you
very
were
long before.
in the Indianapolis
He was not
Symphony.
my first student, however.
Uh-huh.
Abe Torchinsky.
Right.
My first one had a career with the Air Force Band in Washington, Ed Whitfield. And I think I was 17 or 16, and he was 17 or 18. Mm-hmm. And he played bass trombone for a while with the Philadelphia Orchestra during the war, when they had people coming in for short-term periods. And he played with the Indianapolis Symphony. You probably know Ed Whitfield.
No, I don't believe.
But he played as solo baritone for the Air Force Band for many years till retirement. Then he played with the Long Beach Municipal Band. He was my first student. My second one was Abe Torchinsky, who later played so many years with you with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Then I think Irv was probably my third.
Well, let's find out about 1936 and 1937.
Right.
What kind of a player was this man, Irv?
Well, the people in the orchestra were new. Savitsky organized the orchestra on a full major scale that fall of 37, and he rated Curtis and Juilliard and this NBC Symphony, 4 players. So he showed up at the conservatory, which is part of Butler University, and I will say this for you, Mr. Jacobs, everybody flocked to hear that fabulous Arnold play in the symphony. Veterans ticket holders did too. Well, I'd like to, if you could remember, tell the experience you had when you filled in for Bill Bell down at Cincinnati.
Armco Band.
Armco Band,
Right.
and you went into the studio and read the concert
you
Colt
are.
on the double C. Could you tell us something about that, please?
Well, the Cincinnati Orchestra was on tour. And of course, they brought the Chicago, number of us, not from the Chicago Symphony, but from the Indianapolis Symphony, to substitute for the Cincinnati players who were not available at the time. Now, did you have a particular incident in mind with that?
Irv told me the story once. Why don't we let him tell? Would you like to tell that?
All I said was that he went down to this broadcast, which is a Sunday afternoon, and walked into the studio. And then, of course, C horns weren't commonly used in B-flat concert bands, and you read it on a C horn. Read the concert. That's the impression I remember with.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
Well, then you went to the Pittsburgh Symphony. Is that right?
After 2 seasons with Fabian Savitsky, Fritz Reiner called me to go with the Pittsburgh Symphony.
Now, he'd been at Curtis when you were there.
Yes, and I had told him I'm already under contract with the Indianapolis Symphony, and in those days I never had any funds put aside, so I always had to borrow money from management to either go home or to get back on the job. And I was already in debt to the Indianapolis Symphony, I think to the tune of about $300. And so I told Dr. Reiner that I'm under contract here, and there's very little chance of me getting out of this contract this year. And because I knew that they wouldn't release me if I owed them money. Anyway, I decided not to take the audition. And some of my students at that time were going to take the audition. It was to be held at Steinway Hall in New York. So one day, John Hermala, who was the personnel manager of the Pittsburgh Symphony and a friend of Dr. Reiner's, came to the knocking on the door. And he says, Dr. Reiner wants you to come for that audition. And I said, well, I'm under contract, but I'll go and play if he wants me to. So one of my students was driving in for the audition, so I drove to New York with this student. There were 25 players trying out for the Pittsburgh Symphony and some good names. But anyway, they pulled me out of line and put me up front, and I played. I played for an hour. He had been my conductor for 7 years at the Curtis Institute. He knew everything I did, but he auditioned me for a solid hour, everything that he could think of. Then when he was through, I talked business with his manager and so forth. He still had 24 more auditions to give, but I was already being hired, except that I had no way of knowing whether I could go or not. Anyway, we set salary, and he says, you'll hear from us. So I didn't hear anything till 2 weeks before I was to leave Philadelphia and go back to work. I didn't know whether to drive to Indianapolis or to Pittsburgh. 2 weeks before I go, I got a contract from the Pittsburgh Orchestra. He traded his first cello player to Fabian Savitsky for me. And that was the only way we could make the exchange. So I wound up owing the Pittsburgh Symphony instead of the Indianapolis Symphony.
And then later you went to Chicago before he went to Chicago. So did you return the favor and hire him in Chicago?
I was one of those that they called a group of us up. He used to guest conduct. And I don't know how many of you remember Fritz Reiner, but this man was a super conductor, just magnificent conductor. I can't say, to me, he is the greatest conductor I've ever worked for. I've had other great ones and so forth, and it's not the one I like the most, but he was really a great conductor, but somewhat of a difficult person in some ways. But anyway, I was called up along with several other musicians, Bud Hurst and the concertmeister of the Chicago Symphony, because they knew I'd worked with him, and they wanted to know what we thought. You know, they were thinking of hiring him for the Chicago Symphony, and of course we were all very enthusiastic about it. And I told my colleagues, sure, he has a difficult reputation, but he's older, he's mellowed. They threw that up to me for the 12 years that he was there. I never heard the end of that. He had not mellowed. He was very much the disciplinarian, which we could tolerate, you know. But it was a wonderful period musically. If you listen to the old Chicago recordings of that period, you'll hear great music by a great orchestra and a great conductor. But believe me, they were exciting years. I often told friends that I would rather be bored to death than frightened to death. So.
Then you were in one of the premier brass quintets that
The premier brass
The
quintet.
premier, all right. And the recording that I'm aware of is certainly one of the first that I'm aware of.
That's right.
One of the greatest things about your teaching, I think, happened on that recording to me. The Beethoven string quartet that you recorded.
Oh, sure.
You
Yes,
start out
right.
the theme with that.
Right.
Anytime I would be far away from you and need a little refresher course, I would just put that on. I don't know. Have any of you had that experience? I see a lot of head nodding. Would anyone else? Anyone else have a favorite moment or spot?
I'm Bob Rusk. I play tuba with the Milwaukee Symphony, and I am a former IU student. And part of my education process here took place in the dorms late at night, as I think most of our educations do. There was an older grad student who played the Reiner Strauss recordings over and over and over again, and we studied all the various brass players. But one day he brought in a recording that you did of the Song of the Nightingale by Stravinsky.
Yes.
And towards the end there is a solo middle F for tuba that you
Right.
play, and it's
I
marked
remember that.
crescendo. And we played that, and it got louder and louder, and one note. And my sophomore year, when I was here, I had a program of the Chicago concerts coming up, and I saw that it was on the Chicago program that week. So the Friday night of that concert, I borrowed a car and drove to my hometown, South Bend, and borrowed another car and drove into Chicago and bought a ticket to the concert up in the gallery there and waited to see if that one note was as it was on the recording. And it was, and I drove home and left off one car and got the other car, and I must have driven 600 miles that weekend to hear one note. It was well worth the
Well,
trip.
thank you.
We've been talking a great deal about tuba. I wonder how, we have several trumpet players in our audience, and I wonder how it might be to be taught trumpet by a tuba player. Keith, would you like to speak about that?
Yes, my name is Keith Johnson, and I teach at the University of Northern Iowa. I was privileged to begin study with Mr. Jacobs about 3 years ago, and the thing that I remember as perhaps the most shocking was that I went in one time to play for him some piccolo trumpet excerpts from the B minor Mass of Bach, and I was absolutely flabbergasted to find out that this man knew more about piccolo trumpet than I could ever hope to know. He seemed to know the problems inside and out. I'm certain that he hasn't played the piccolo trumpet, because when he played the piccolo trumpet, or when he played trumpet, there were no piccolo trumpets.
Right.
I guess what I would like to know is how you know so much about an instrument that you obviously have probably never held, let alone played.
I could answer that by saying I know some of the requirements in order to play the piccolo trumpet well. And so I always work with the person who plays the instrument and how you apply yourself to it. There are certain rules that we go by. And again, there's a simplifying process around, you know. And it's the dominance of being a musician and not allowing yourself to be disrupted by the feedback of the phenomena of sensory perception based on feel. Sound is all right, but not the feel phenomena. And these are such radical changes that the question is, how do you keep a sense of normalcy by going into an extreme of this type? And of course you do it by finding what are the minimal states necessary to do this, and then still keep the lip vibrating, still keep the air under proper flow and pressure and so forth. And you do this based on musical thoughts, not piccolo trumpet thoughts. It just happens that you're playing up in that range, you could do it on your big trumpet. And in other words, an embouchure in a person, when they start to move to the frequency of vibration, a high note is simply a fast vibration. The higher it goes, the faster the lip has to vibrate. You have the rules of physics, the laws that govern that: length, thickness, and tension. So obviously there's going to be lack of length, there's going to be changes in tension states and so forth. But we have to recognize that you don't have conscious control of the embouchure based on the knowledge of the various fiber groups that have to function. So you're still going to motivate them simply by the concepts of sound as you've developed over the years as a musician. Then we try to carry this normalcy up into the range of frequency that you're going without changing the physical principles that govern you when you play your own trumpet. There are changes, And there are drastic changes in terms of perception, the phenomena of feel, and so forth. And we have to make sure that these are put into perspective so the musical thoughts are dominant. Very frequently I'll have the person playing on piccolo trumpet just work with songs, just work with simple melodies. If he does it in the lower range of his piccolo trumpet, he's in the higher range of his normal trumpet. The crossover is there, so we put a musical dominance in there. We find certain aspects of the work effort, so you'll do whatever's required, but you don't do it based on the concepts of physical strength, you do it based on the concepts of music.
I think those of us who are here are initiated into that. We understand that very well.
Sure.
However, in teaching, as our second generation of Jacob
Right.
students, it is very difficult, it seems like, to get that across, especially to the young player. They're so caught up in the mechanical aspects of playing. Do you find that to be the case?
I am very alerted to it. I expect it because an intelligent human being wants to know how to do things, how to proceed. In other words, there's a great fear of being wrong. There's a great fear of doing things that might damage your ability to do these things in the future. You have to dispel that first of all. It's better to take a terrible sound and make it into a good one than to try to have silence and do it. In other words, in the study of physical skills, you'll find you never start with skill. You develop skill. If you're taking a physical maneuver like a golf swing or trying to stand on your hands or dance or whatever, you don't, the first time you try it, there'll be crudities, and you soon develop skill by having the concept of what, either by imitation of having heard somebody else do it, or watch a dancer or a golfer or what, but you have to learn to go for the product you're going for. So I take the young student who wants to know how to proceed and I direct his thoughts into how he must sound. Then I give him the liberty to do things wrong, to adjust the embouchure any way he wants, providing he doesn't get too involved in the embouchure, but trial and error procedures. I set challenges of control of product, not control of methodology. And with a student, once you get him motivated into the concepts of sound so that in the thinking levels of the brain, it's like a tape recorder. It will send signals to the tissues, to the levels of the brain that control tissue. And I make sure always that the brain is involved in the concept of sound and phrase. And I've had many players here, Mr. Picar is one on piccolo, and yourself, and who have developed quite into excellent players on the piccolo trumpet by very simple means like this. The idea is not to allow these complications to stay with a student just because they can't do something. They're trying to find how they can do it. They have to develop.
We have your very good friend, Dr. Sheldon Kirshner here. You're tampering on his territory
My
just
assistant.
a little. Yes, very good.
Not everybody has their doctor as the assistant.
Dr. Kirshner is a psychologist and lawyer and sometime French horn player, or maybe many times French horn player, and good friend of yours. Would you like to speak to that area?
He has one of the finest low registers you'll ever hear on French horn.
I would like to say in that regard that when I was playing with the Civic Orchestra in Chicago, I was playing principal, and some friends and I went to hear a concert that Arnold played the Vaughan Williams tuba concerto on, and one of my friends asked me, well, what did you learn today? And I said, I learned how the fourth horn goes. And that was it. I would ask you a question. What is, if there is one, the commonest important physical problem in playing that you come across with students? Commonest important physical problem in
I would
playing.
say the one that I've confronted most is simply tension states that should not be there. Usually it shows in the respiratory system, and then it influences laryngeal, pharyngeal regions. In other words, there's an influence throughout all of your playing to where a substitution of isometrics, in other words, where we want changes, in other words, there's a bellows activity in the respiratory system. And when air has to move, some parts of you will get smaller. When you move air in, some part has to get larger. And there's a substitution or a stasis where everything stays still, where there's strength, but no change. We have to go back to where we permit the bellows activity and change, and we have to avoid the situation where one says we're integrated into being a complete person, and there are tremendous influences and relationships between various parts of your structures. And what happens in the lower respiratory tract affects the upper respiratory tract. There are tremendous relationships. I find very frequently a malfunction, this is the most common, where respiration on the brass player is put into a state of, you might say, static pressure. And as a result, you cannot have the phenomena of flow with it. The dominance is like a bow where you're pressing. We need motion. So the phenomena of air with motion is what I have to try to achieve with a student who at that time is simply there with the bow pressing on the string as an analogous situation where in terms of the life patterns of the individual, he has gone to the, you might say, the function of isometrics that you have in conflict, certain stabilizations, or the bearing down of childbirth, defecation. These are blueprints in every living person, in every brain. We have to find respiration, and that you have a bellows activity. If you want to blow vigorously, it still has to be blowing, not squeezing, because the other puts pressures in the wrong place. That's how you herniate yourself or create problems.
The same is true with players who sometimes develop a web-like quality in their neck.
Exactly.
So their neck puffs out. That's just from over-pressurizing.
There can also be congenital weaknesses in this region where some individuals lose their, don't have the tolerance for pharyngeal pressure, and then they will balloon out and they will have broken webbing, broken tissues there.
There almost seems to be an instinct in the brass player to somehow physically resist his instrument or to do more work than is necessary. I mean, you've proven to me that
I'm lazy.
Why is the average brass player would probably come to you with a great deal of contraction over the rib cage and over the abdomen and be working too hard to no purpose?
Even as a child, where brass players get together, you might say the concepts of the early part of the century and the late part of the last century were based on strength factors in playing, and there has come a traditional type of thinking where there is considerable efforts to play these instruments. And as I pointed out in my lecture today, there's a region with a potential of 100, 150 pounds of isometric contraction of being able to support this young lady on the chest and abdomen. These are muscles that have to do with moving air in and out of the body. Here we're dealing in a phenomena that it's hard work to move 3 pounds of air pressure. That's usually maximal. In coughing, it can easily develop into 5 or 6 pounds of intrathoracic pressures. But in terms of conscious use of air, it rarely exceeds 3 pounds. On tuba, I'm rarely over 10 ounces, mostly under 5 ounces. Playing a flute, sometimes I have to use water measurements in order to get down because ounces actually won't go low enough on flute, and yet they're using large volumes of air. They rarely exceed 10 ounces maximal in blowing very loud. So, but most of the playing is done without tremendous physical strength, but considerable change. When you put numerographic equipment around a person's body and you watch them play, you'll see large changes in terms of a bellows. If they hold themselves stabilized in the abdominal region, you'll find change in the upper thoracic region. But somewhere, when you have pressure of air, there's reduction, and when you have movement of air, there's reduction for both pressure and movement. Well, we have to have change, not stability.
I've noticed many times, well, I think almost exclusively, the women or lady students that I've had, girl students, seem to have a very, very fine sound. Maybe nothing else, but a
Sure.
great sound. Would that have to do with what you're speaking about?
And it also has to do with the aesthetics. In other words, some of the ladies become aggressive because they are ladies in a field that seems to be dominated by men. So occasionally I have young ladies come to see me who are aggressively playing trumpet or horn to the point where they're competing in terms of volume with the male, and they show they've got the strength and this and that. But basically, I think the ladies tend to go more for a lyricism, a more refined sound, and I, of course, try to encourage this. To me, the love song is one of the basic factors of tone production. I prefer to see tone production based on lyricism, where we have the finest qualities. To me, this is like tuning up an engine on a car. You'll get your finest performance based on the use of motor activity in response to minimal use of gas with a finely tuned engine. You can detune the engine and the car will move slower, but you will not save gas then. In other words, you've lost efficiency. The love song, the lyric aspect of playing brass tends to act just like the tune-up on the car. You get your finest tone production and you maneuver it into other emotional states. You maneuver it into the fanfare, but with quality. You're maneuvered into varieties of interpretations and styles, but where this lyric quality tends to go through. Then as an artist, you have tools. If you want stridency, in other words, if you have an emotional state where the music calls for somebody to have their throat cut or something, you don't want a wonderful love song. At that time, as an artist with conceptual thoughts, you will deliver stridency. But you always try to go by the mood of your interpretation. The basic one, I think, should be lyric, sounding good.
Yeah, John Hansen, trombonist, University of Northern Iowa. One of your concepts that I have found to be so helpful, and I would like to have you share with the other people, is the dual role that you alluded to earlier for those of us that are in the business of playing and teaching.
As I said, I've watched many fine players go downhill when they've started teaching. Many careers were actually aborted too early by people who became teachers, and you have to look at what teaching involves. It involves a tremendous amount of analysis. In other words, here's this magnificent human brain, which we all have, trying to learn what the student is doing. You try to hear what they're doing, you try to guess what they're thinking, how to communicate, but the brain is wide open for incoming messages through the eyes, through the ears. In other words, the question state of the brain becomes very dominant. There's a tremendous risk to this that you carry it over into your practice and you start self-teaching based on the same questions. We don't play by questions, we play by statements. We use psychomotor. When you're going to play, you'll always play based on a message for somebody else. Da, 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 da. It's a voice. You understand what I'm doing there in a sense. I'm not controlling embouchure, I'm controlling the sound. When I've controlled the sound, I've controlled the meat. I can't do that if I'm going into self-analysis. In other words, this is simply a readout of my thoughts. If you have a question, you will not have the stimuli in the brain for the reflex response in your tissue. It's that simple. You wear different hats. When you talk to somebody else, you've got to have something to say. If you're listening, then you receive. Now, there are qualifying factors. There are always low-level feedback systems where you'll always know somewhat what you're doing. But I had a PhD come to me for once, a brass player. May I just get this in?
Sure.
This PhD played dreadfully. It was just awful. He could out-talk me and outright me a dozen different ways with his knowledge of brass playing. It was mostly wrong. But he was very fluent and very good at writing on the subject and talking on the subject, but it was not right. When he played, again, there was this lack of communication between different levels of his own brain. He played by the slide, he played by the notes and all the mechanics of it. I finally got this man who was talented in art to draw a picture of his wife by memory. Then we analyzed how he got the picture on the paper. And of course he has to have it in his brain, and there he's forming it line by line for me to view, and it really was quite good. And of course we have to extrapolate this then back into the same concepts for sound, not just drawing it with paper and pencil, but into the tonal factors. It's the same thing, and immediately there was progress. So the question, as you stated, the answer is you have to create a discipline for yourself, that when the horn is in your hand, you become a storyteller of sound and phrase and all the inputs of your art form. When you teach, analyses, but don't permit the student then to do the analyzing in the sense that he's the one telling the story. Use a tape recorder. And then instead of analyzing his playing while he's playing, he analyzes it on the playback. Immediately, the microphone becomes an audience. It's a very fine tool. Have somebody listening out there. Make them use imitation if necessary. I think I mentioned this morning about the trumpet player. I'll have him imitate Bud Herseth. And when he does, we'll say on the Promenade from Pictures, immediately we get a first-class performance from a man who might have been having great difficulty up to that moment. Well, maybe the next time would be difficult, but that one performance indicates that it could be done if the signals and tissue response to signal are right. So just wear different hats.
Andy Anders, I'm a low brass instructor at Arkansas Tech and also a tubist with the Arkansas Symphony Orchestra. I think it's somewhat fitting in this, that it's significant that at a workshop like this, everyone is asking questions about what do you play and what kind of mouthpiece and all this. But looking back at the at what really is important to us about music, and looking back, my last lesson with you was 16 years ago, and the thing that stands out most vividly of all those lessons were the 2 times that you spent a great deal of time in those lessons playing. And whenever I need a little bit of inspiration or something, that's the thing I can remember. And it's exactly what you're talking about now. You wore the performer's hat, and it was wonderful.
I think the finest form of teaching there is demonstration.
Yes.
In other words, play for a student and have them listen to you. Imitation is one of the powerful learning tools. If you take the newborn child and watch, and as the eyes open, see how they follow motion, how they are making vocal sounds, but usually M's and N's, and then gradually they're hearing the parents talk. They're hearing the brothers and sisters talk. They can't talk. In other words, the development of fibers in the oral cavity and so forth, the tongue, there has been no real hypertrophy of the muscles that are going to shape for speech and so forth. And in their brain, they are imitating excellence. Then they come out with baby talk, goo goo and dada and all sorts of the sounds of the baby. But in the brain is an excellent example. What comes out is not excellent. Then it develops from that into proper language, proper diction, patterns based on having heard it. But the tissues have to be able to carry out the instruction from the brain. So the guidance has to be very sophisticated in the brain by hearing good examples. Imitation is one of the powerful, powerful learning tools. Now we learn through sight and sound just beautifully, and these tools can be put into your teaching techniques so beautifully.
Yes, I think it's not only a very important tool for the student, but very important for the teacher. As
Exactly.
you mentioned, I
Then
believe
there's-
this will help alleviate some of those problems that you mentioned
There's
before.
a factor in teaching you should know about. You have to be very sensitive to your students' needs. And to do that, you have to, in some way, be able to equate with this student. And if necessary, try to think like this student. That means you must study their background a little bit. You must have some knowledge of the student, his use of language. To issue a word, if I use the word like hypertrophy and the person doesn't know what it means, then we have to change it into the growth that occurs as in weightlifting and so forth. We have to find words that have meaning and understanding for the student. We can issue messages from now till doomsday, but if the student can't receive it, there's no meaning. It doesn't. You have to find how can you equate with the student. So if you're going to guide him, I've had jazz musicians come in and they're into a situation of serious musical interpretation. First thing I do, I have them go up to an imaginary microphone and play me one of the tunes from the book that they use on the job. I don't want to hear what he's doing or the Haydn trumpet concerto. I want to hear Body and Soul, something he knows. And they're falling apart up to that moment. When they find their own level, then I hear that experience and what they can accomplish. Then we work from that. We sneak in the back door, always on a problem. We don't confront a problem head on. Where a man has difficulty, we don't try to correct that difficulty. We find where he can function. Then we sneak that function into the difficulty. In other words, we overcome the difficult without their even being aware of it. We sneak up on it. You have to do this because, as I say, you have very little communication in a two-way sense with the machine system. The fifth cranial nerve, and where the embouchure is concerned, is probably purely sensory. There are other parts of it in various phases where there are certain motor activities. The seventh cranial nerve is the motor nerve that governs the embouchure. What you learn by feel is completely inadequate to make judgments. In other words, your lip feels good when you sound good, and it feels bad when you sound bad. Which comes first? You see what I mean? And so, really, when you teach this sort of subject, you do it based very much on insisting that the student becomes a fine musician and becomes musically apt to deliver a musical product to somebody else. Not how he does it. Get the music, get it all wrong, but make it sound great. The next generation will try to do it your way.
We have a question from the gentleman on the front row here.
Sure.
Charles Vernon. I play bass trombone with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And when I went to see you the first time in 1969, I believe it was, I was going with the aspect of thinking that I was going to become the greatest player in the world in about 5 minutes after seeing you, after hearing of you and everything. And when I came in there, I was playing, I was a tenor trombonist at that time, and I played a Rochu for you, the number 2 Rochu. And I played it, and it was not very good. But I remember you told me to think about what would the greatest trombonist in the world sound like. Take a picture, put a picture in your head of all the players that you would think their sounds that you like and all this kind of stuff, and put it in your head. And at that moment when you said that, my first reaction was, what is he talking about? Because I was expecting to learn how to play, like you were talking earlier.
Sure.
But you were pretty insistent, and
Sure.
I remember you asked me to close my eyes and really think about that sound. And I did that, and I thought about that first C, and it was like a completely different player. I made it to, I got the C and barely made it to the A, and by the time I was to the C, I was back to where I was before. But what I'm getting at is just the concept of I got it for one note at one point, and over the years, I think I've been able to transfer that to the other end of it. But I really appreciate that.
You'll never know how you did it. This is the remarkable thing, is that you're never going to have feedback of the type necessary to know what you're doing in terms of physical function.
Nor is it
You'll know what
important.
you're doing in terms of musical function.
Mm-hmm.
And the important thing, again, the product of all inputs for your instrument is sound that comes out the bell. Being a human being, you always go by the sound that comes out in other words, you go by the end product. Just catch this, bud. Then you describe how you do it. You know what I mean? I can't see it, so you'll have to hand it to me. But do it with one hand. Just pick it up. You'll never know how you do these things. You do them. The human body works on the study of products. In other words, what are you trying to accomplish? You want to put a step, walk in that direction, walk. Don't go by this muscle and that muscle and the chain of command that permits the skeletal structure to move. But you do it by what you want to accomplish. If I want to drink a little water, skull. I take a little drink, and I don't go by the various phenomena, because it's not just the deltoids. It's not this muscle or that muscle in the hand. There are many changes all over the body to do what I just did. You leave the complexity alone, and like the jungle child doing dances and flute, go to the product of music. Don't figure how you're going to do it. Let the people who are going into medicine study how you do it. It's nice. I'm perfectly willing to work with any student and give them any knowledge that I have as to structure. But function is a different study. There we go into Dr. Kirshner's field of psychodynamics, thoughts that are going to stimulate motor responses. This is what we use in the art form. And believe me, I was a very successful player before I knew anything about this. I can't do anything today that I couldn't do when I was 25 years old or 20 years old.
Hello, Michael Moore, the Atlanta Symphony tuba player. I'd like to say that one thing that has impressed me, one of the things that has impressed me the most about your approach is the positive reinforcement part of it, in that I can be having a really awful lesson and just everything going wrong, and then by the end of the lesson things are starting to come around, and then you'll put your hand on your knee and say, you know, you're really a fine artist, and things like that. And just the idea of you take that home with you, thinking of the conception of I am a fine artist, and then when you play the horn, you are a fine artist. You know, you don't even, no matter how badly you do in the lesson. Maybe that's not true of everyone, but it's all relative, and you always manage to reinforce the fact that you are an artist, play like an artist. Yeah.
Well, you are, like Mr. Farkas said today. There's periods. There's always a plus or minus going on, and the days on the minus side can be extremely distressing. But you'll find you're not rotten all those days. You're just less good than you were on the days when you're on the plus side. And they change around. If somebody came in there and said, here's $100,000 a week, you're going to come and play with me now, you would suddenly play so good on those bad days, you know, that it just, you would never know why it changed so much, but your mental attitude changes.
My name is David Keene, and I'm the music administrator at California State University, Long Beach, and at this point a sometime tubist. I was very interested to be reminded this morning that you spent some time in Long Beach, and you recall the name Herbert L. Clark, and I think most of us agree that he had a significant contribution to make to the band movement. And also the Long Beach Municipal Band, I think, has had a significant contribution to make in the historical development of the band program. Do you have any observation or memories of those years in Long Beach and listening to and watching the Long Beach Band?
I have a few. That's a long, long time ago. But I used to love to go there because you had the greatest popcorn in the world at that time. There was a little place where they dispensed orange sherbet on a slab. They would take a cone and you get a big slab of orange sherbet. This was, they had the Pike. This is before the big earthquake, I think around 29. I was 4 or 5 years old, and of course I was born in 1915, so you can imagine how far back that is. But anyway, I remember this so well. The popcorn and the ice cream was very important to me, and there was a theater which, if you look in your history of, it was called the Wigwam, and it had a blue fluorescent light in front. It was the first one I've ever seen, and that stands out very clearly. Then I remember a man getting up and playing a solo on a sousaphone, which impressed me tremendously, and it was probably excellent. I can't remember what it was, but I can just remember being so surprised to hear it. And I've heard the cornet solos, and particularly the baritone solos with a nice fast vibrato, and in this typical style, the cadenzas and so forth, and I was very much influenced by that. And we also had a chance to buy property on Signal Hill before they discovered oil, and my mother, being somewhat overweight, went up to look at the property on Signal Hill, and she thought, this is great. It overlooks the Pacific Ocean, but she said it was uncomfortable for her, being somewhat overweight, to walk up, so she bought property at the base of Signal Hill. Oil was discovered very close to the property that she turned down. I would never have played tuba. I'd have been so busy spending all that money that we didn't quite make. Let me tell you another interesting thing about California. May I digress from music? I had a movie career. Yeah. I was in a film.
I see why you're so comfortable here today.
I did a shot. In those days, they would come around and knock on your door and ask if they could use children as extras in the movies. And they needed a youngster. Again, I was maybe 5, 6, something like that, and I had long blonde hair. And I ate a ice cream cone in one of Mary Pickford's silent films, and I remember my parents received $5 for that. I didn't get it. But they got $5 for my eating that ice cream cone, and I have never seen that picture. If you ever see any of the silent films with Mary Pickford and you see a little blonde boy eating an ice cream cone, let me know which one it is. Because I did, it was a very short career, one shot. But
a thing that has dominated this discussion, and I think that is probably very significant, is some of the things that have been mentioned here, is that in all your teaching, and we've all been the recipients of this and have all benefited, is the positive approach and the fact that your teaching has been musical and musically stimulating. And very rarely, if ever, has it been technically oriented. We've all benefited from that, no doubt. However, sometimes it gets very technical. I took my lessons over on Normal, and one of the methods of communication, Mrs. Jacobs was always upstairs, and one day when he wanted to reach her, he was fumbling through some mouthpieces and had one here, and he said, No, this is the wrong mouthpiece. Put it down, picked up a big one, reached up and banged a pipe with it. And that's as technical as it ever got.
I frequently have to be technical in the sense that I'm responding to some of the needs of the students. Many teachers come to see me. There are many inquiring minds that will not stay with me unless I can first answer some of the technical questions. In other words, again, I gauge the student that comes to see me based on our first words together and what happens, and then I try to go based on establishing some form of two-way communication. Now, many times I have to what I consider over-teach. It's not that I want to or need to. It's simply that whoever I'm teaching with seems to feel that that's what he needs. Then I can either pull rank and say, no, you do it this way, or I can cooperate if it's somebody I'm going to see over a time period and say, all right, so we will start with the subject of anatomy and physiology, if that's what they want to know. Then I tell them, you're not going to use this in the playing. You will use this in understanding some of the functions of playing. But this, again, is not going through the control panel. In other words, knowing the muscles doesn't mean you're going to be able to control them as individuals. You can't control individual muscles. They're controlled based on functions of your body as a living organism. There is no way you can control a muscle. You control what they're doing for you. And then that way there will be group functions at work. You can't just control a diaphragm or a this or that. Every time you use one muscle, others come into play that are associated with systems of function. And these systems of function are complex and should be allowed to remain complex and be handled by a wonderful computer activity of the lower brain. In other words, the higher centers ordering all sorts of products and other levels that are going to coordinate these vastly divergent fiber groups and allow them to function for you. Then you can use your brain to cope with all the problems of life without trying to cope with the enormous complexities of tissue function. I couldn't begin to control myself that way.
As with all these lessons that we've had with you, many times stimulate us to ask more questions and think more. However, time's got to slipped up on us at this moment. We'd like to continue this a little bit later. We'd also, I'm sure I can speak for all of you, John mentioned the house and on Normal Avenue that most of us were, the hospitality that you shared with us and Mrs. Jacobs.
Thanks to Mrs. Jacobs.
Oh, yes. It was wonderful. And the coffee and all the things, the sitting up and waiting, listening to the music down below of the previous lesson, and occasionally the great sounds when the master picked up his horn was really quite an experience. And,
when Star Trek came on, we would leave the basement and go upstairs and watch Star Trek. Then we would go down and work again.
Right. At any rate, for your hospitality and your friendship, we'd all like to thank you very much.
Thank you.